Thanks for joining us today. We're going to talk a little bit about vocabulary and what makes word learning work. I'm going to start with a story from my own life. A couple of years ago, I decided I should go back and learn about the human brain. A lot of people are talking about their brains. A lot of people are talking about being brain-based educators. And I was feeling kind of bad because I didn't really know much about the brain. I'd never taken any kind of neurosciences classes in my graduate degree programs. So I was feeling like I needed to go learn something. So I went online, found a class over the summer, made a commitment. I'm going to take that class. I'm going to do this. I'm going to learn this. And very proud of myself. Told everybody at school where I worked that I was doing this. And signed up, paid the fees, got going. And a couple days later, I get the syllabus and the online learning environment. And I decide I better read the book over the summer because I'm kind of busy in the fall. And I'll get some advanced work done on that class. So I buy the book on Amazon. It comes a couple days later, and it says, somites are blocks of dorsal mesodermal cells adjacent to the notochord during vertebrate organogenesis. I am now a struggling reader. I don't know what these words mean. I don't know how to figure out what to do with these words. I'm very stuck with this. And this is only chapter 1 introduction. It's not like I'm deep into the book yet. I am stuck from the very beginning. There are lots of intervention programs out there for struggling readers. Many of them take a phonics approach, and some kids do need phonics as their intervention. I don't need a phonics intervention. If you buy a phonics program from me and it's this content, it's not going to be effective. Some kids need that, some kids don't. We assess them to determine what they need. It's very popular to have a fluency intervention. If you purchase a fluency intervention for me, it wouldn't work either, because simply reading this sentence or these two sentences faster is not going to help me understand them. It's very popular right now to apply a comprehension strategy instruction approach. We have teachers talking about predicting and summarizing and clarifying and questioning and monitoring and inferring and all those kinds of things. So I invite you to make a prediction about what you think the author would say next. And if you can't do that, could you visualize this in your mind? Somites are blocks of dorsal mesodermal cells. Can you picture that in your mind? Does that movie play for you? Comprehension strategies work when you have background knowledge and when you have vocabulary. Comprehension strategies don't work when you don't have background knowledge and vocabulary. And this is probably the first time I really understood that. Being in a class as a fairly proficient reader and reading something that I really didn't understand. It caused me to reflect on my teaching, my experiences, my learning. We talk about struggling as if it's part of the learner's identity. You are a struggling reader. You are a struggling writer, a struggling mathematician. And I think we need to do some revision on that. It's not about the identity of the learner. It's the situation that learner is in. I was then a struggling learner. I could not read the assigned textbook. Thankfully, I know something about learning, and so I decided to close the book for the rest of the summer, go to the first day of class. My teacher will teach me how to read, think, process, and learn this content that I so desperately want to learn. On the first night of class, the teacher was reviewing slides and pictures of the brain and all this stuff, and someone in the class, there were 19 of us, 18 full-time doctoral students, unemployed, and me. And one of them raised their hand and asked a question, and my teacher responded, I don't know how you're going to learn this, but it's on the test. And at that moment, my confidence sank. I already didn't know how I was going to learn it, and now my teacher didn't know how I was going to learn it either. It's very demoralizing when the teacher doesn't know how you're going to learn. And I really thought about that experience as well. When my teacher said this, I lost a lot of confidence. It wasn't just the curriculum, it wasn't just the instruction. It's what the teacher believed about us and about her power to teach us. So I was ready to quit. I almost did quit. And had I not told everybody at school that I was taking this class, I would have quit. But I had told everybody at school, so I was going to try and stick it out a little bit longer. And my friend Jeff Bonine, a biology teacher at our school, said, why don't you borrow the 10th grade biology book? There's about 90 pages on the central nervous system in that book. There's probably some information you can use. And sure enough, there's all this information about lobes and hemispheres and blood supply and all this stuff that the 10th graders get. And I can read a 10th grade book. So I borrowed that book, and I did some reading. And I started building my background knowledge, And background knowledge is the words. If you have a concept and a label that match, you have background knowledge. And that's what I needed. I needed some accessible information to keep building that background knowledge so I would have those words, that I knew what those words meant. I was on Amazon one time. No, this is when I stopped at the bookstore. On the way home from class one night, I decided to buy myself some more reading material, and I went to a bookstore, and I found this book, which I might not have recommended in the past. When you're a novice, this series is very, very helpful. When you already know something about the content, this series is less helpful. This is the one I found on Amazon one afternoon. I was looking for more reading materials, and I found this book, and I scanned the cover in so you can see it. Clinical Neuroanatomy Made Ridiculously Simple. Interactive edition. 3 DVDs designed to help you learn through cartoons, postmortem, pictures, and MRIs about what parts of the brain you're looking at, where you're seeing it, what happens when that part's damaged. I learned a ton from these books, reading things that I could read, and all the while, my background knowledge and my vocabulary is increasing. That semester, I watched over 100 YouTube videos. There are tons of videos out on YouTube about brain surgery, brain lectures, all kinds of free stuff. PBS published a 5 DVD series called The Secret Life of the Brain, which I bought and watched. There's all these internet quiz sites about neuroanatomy, mostly for medical students, that I practiced on, making sure I knew what I was looking at so that I would pass my test. And I will talk to anyone who will listen to me talk about the brain. I really was completely and totally immersed in this so that I could learn it. And then the midterm comes, and it's 17 pages long, single-spaced, 200 multiple-choice questions. I have never worked so hard for anything besides that test. And I got a B+ on that test. And I really have thought a lot about how I passed a graduate neuroanatomy seminar with really not being able to read the assigned textbook. A lot of it was me reading and me writing and me thinking in books I could read. The developing my understanding and my thinking and my work around things that were accessible to me so I could build that background knowledge and I could build that vocabulary. In addition, I know that talking to other people really helped me master that content. I would send an email out every week to all the people in the class, all of them, all 18 of them, and say, meet me in the Commons at 5 o'clock. Our class was at 7 o'clock at night on Thursdays. Meet me in the Commons at 5 o'clock, and I'll buy dinner. And I would buy them anything they wanted to eat or drink as long as they would talk to me. And I think part of my ability to pass the class is because I built that interaction, that talking time for myself. It didn't happen in my class. There wasn't a single time that my teacher said, turn to your partner and talk about this, or the 4 of you work on that. It was all her telling us stuff. Super smart lady, very, very good at what she does in terms of her brain research and her brain knowledge, but didn't have the structures in place that could really help me learn. And I think a lot of the other students in the class, as we met for dinner and interacted and talked, we all did better. Besides a little bit of neuroanatomy, I think what I really learned from this experience is background knowledge matters. It is a profound impact on whether or not someone understands something that they're reading. I think background knowledge remains probably, if not the single best predictor, among the best predictors of comprehension. It doesn't get a lot of attention. It's hard to work on. And I think we have to start saying background knowledge is our vocabulary. If you don't know the words for it, comprehension strategy is not going to work. That's not to say if you read so slowly you don't need a fluency program. If you can't sound out the words, you don't know how to read them, you don't need a phonics or intervention program. But when we get to those levels, we have to think about what's the vocabulary and what is that background knowledge the reader has to really understand. I also learned that using the vocabulary and actually using all those technical terms in the speaking and reading and writing made a huge difference for me. Just listening to my teacher use the words, and I participated in all the classes, I attended every class, I enjoyed the class, I enjoyed my classmates, but if I wasn't the one using the words, I didn't start talking that way, if I didn't actually think through the vocabulary, I wouldn't have passed the class. I needed to be held accountable for actually using the words, the vocabulary, the discipline that I was being taught. Vocabulary matters. If you look at this, Peter, giving this a shot, it says expand, and he is expanding it. And his teacher writes, very funny, Peter. what words mean and how students interpret them are really important considerations. It's how we think through what's being expected of us. This one off the internet made me laugh. Find X, and actually the kid is right. There it is. It's how we interpret the words we're being asked to use and think about. We've been building this instructional model since 2001. This is the most current incarnation of our instructional model. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about generally instruction and how I think about high quality instruction, and then specifically how it fits with vocabulary. I think there are 4 phases to every high quality lesson. They do not need to occur in any specific order. They can go, you can start with some independent tasks and go to collaborative. You could start with some focus lessons and go to collaborative. You can come back to guided. You can go in just about any order that makes sense for what you're trying to teach that day. But I do think all 4 of them are necessary for students to reach high levels of achievement. So when I think about high quality instruction, I think there should be a purpose to it. That's the focus lesson part. I think the learner needs to know, what am I supposed to learn today, and why am I supposed to learn this? Sometimes we have an objective that's not interesting or relevant. I think part of our job, and why we say focus lesson and purpose, is to make sure that we talk to students about what we're learning today and why. Why is this important to know? Also, as part of that focus lesson, we model our own thinking. We kind of open up our brains and we say, here's how I'm thinking about this. Thinking is invisible. We have to talk about our thinking. We have to demonstrate the ways in which we solve problems, we notice words, we use context clues, we visualize. We have to notice all those things out loud for our students. So at some phase in the lesson, I'd like to know what I'm supposed to learn and why, and how someone else thinks about that. We call that a focus lesson. At other phases in the lesson, that's guided instruction, we're looking at the errors and misconceptions that students have and make. We're noticing those errors and misconceptions, and we're saying the next right thing for the student to do the work. We're not just telling them the answer or giving them the word in terms of vocabulary. We're taking a look at what was that misconception, what was that error, and can I ask a question, can I provide a prompt, and can I provide a cue that will get the learner to do the work. This has been the hardest part of the instructional model for me to master. I personally was pretty good at whole class focus lessons, modeling, setting the purpose, and then getting students to work collaboratively. And if I noticed a group of students were struggling, I would often go over to them and repeat or tell them what I had just told the whole class. That's really not a very good approach. They've already got the lesson. Now our job is to prompt them, to cue them, to question them, so that they end up doing the thinking and the work. I'm way better at this now. Nancy Fry is very good at this. Guided instruction is the opportunity to ask prompts and cues and questions to transfer the responsibility to the learner and not have the teacher do all of the work. Collaborative learning. I called it collaborative learning many years ago, 2001, because we'd had some teachers in our community had a bad experience with cooperative learning. So in general, we're looking for students talking, interacting, using academic language, and producing things as a result of that. But in every lesson, there's an opportunity for students to interact with one another using the academic language, what we call the language of the lesson. Whatever the major parts of the language are for that lesson, the students have to be using that language in the presence of their peers. And one of the things we've talked about as a school system where I live is that we have a lot of English learners. About 70% of our English learners speak Spanish. It's very common here. All the teachers hear Spanish a lot at school. That's very common for us to hear Spanish. But not everybody speaks Spanish. If it were easy to learn a language from just listening to a language, every teacher in San Diego would be fluent in Spanish. That's not the case. None of us learn a language from listening to a language. We learn a language from producing a language, from using a language. And that's what we're asking in academic English. We want kids to become users of academic English. And the only way they're going to do that is to produce that language in the presence of their peers. They get lots and lots and lots of opportunities to produce language. That's why we want to see a collaborative phase every day in every classroom. And finally, independent learning. We should have kids do things by themselves for which they are accountable, and we can look at their work and determine if they got it or if it's time to move on. We can divide that independent into in-class independent and out-of-class independent. We're pretty good as a profession at in-class independent work. We're not so good at out-of-class independent work, the homework we assign. We can certainly get better at moving to spiral review homework and fluency building homework and that kind of thing. But nonetheless, we should have kids do things on their own independently and hold them accountable for it. You could also imagine starting at the bottom, where kids walk into the class and they start with an independent task, then they talk about that with a partner, they then rewrite it, then we model from that, we set the purpose, we look for errors and correct them. We can go in any order, but all four of them are present for students to learn. Now if we apply that to vocabulary more specifically, some things we have to think about. We have to make it very intentional. Our vocabulary initiative, our vocabulary program has to be very intentional. We have to pick the right words and we have to intentionally teach those words. We can't just hope that students come in contact with a lot of different words. We have to be very intentional about the selection and the instruction that students need. We don't have a lot of time. I mean, most people are willing to give 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes to vocabulary instruction. We don't do it in an intentional way. We're going to have a whole bunch of kids who never learn the words. And we're going to end up with this old vocabulary initiative that we used to have called assign, define, test. I assign the words, you define them as a learner, and then I test you on them. And that's not teaching. That's causing and assigning. So we're looking at very intentional work. How did I pick the words, and how am I going to instruct in those words? Part of that instruction is making word learning transparent through teacher modeling. Not telling kids what the words mean, but when you come to a word that is unfamiliar to the students, we have processes in place for word solving. This is the habit building that's talked about in the Common Core State Standards. We notice in the Common Core State Standards that students should be able to use context clues, word parts, and resources. And that's exactly what we're looking for in this transparent part. They need lots and lots and lots of examples of a more proficient reader encountering an unfamiliar word and figuring it out. And also noticing sometimes you can't figure it out. The context clues just aren't helpful. The word parts aren't working for you. We have to model that. We also have to get students using the words. This is the collaborative learning part. They have to use the words lots and lots of times, lots and lots of practice with those words in collaborative learning. And then they have to make it personal. It has to become part of their responsibility to use those words individually and across their school day. The last practice we're looking for is turning vocabulary into a school-wide priority, that every teacher knows that vocabulary development is the key to success. If you know the words and you have the background knowledge, lots of other things at school are much easier. So we have to think about more carefully about how you pick the words. What does it take to have a word list that's worthy of being taught? Some of the words that we should look at are the basic word list words. These are the everyday 3,000 words in everyday English, and some of those words need some instruction, and some of those words get a little bit confusing. So we look through the basic word list. We look at the background knowledge word list. What are the prerequisite words so a student understands the background knowledge that's going to be required for that content area like science or social studies or language arts. The academic words that change their meaning in different contents and contexts. There are lots of words that have different meanings in different areas. And if I say the word vessel to a student, it matters if I'm in science or if I'm in social studies. Is it a blood vessel or is it a ship? And we have millions of examples, just tons and tons of examples of words that pretty significantly change their meaning in different contexts. So we have to use those words that are academic in nature, that have high utility, but that transfer across lots of contexts. And that's how we build a word list that makes sense for teaching. You can't teach every single word a student will need to know. A whole bunch of the words that they need to know, they're going to learn from and while reading. There's a lot of evidence that we learn a lot of words as we read. If we read enough, our vocabulary grows. There's some words that we need a lot more systematic instruction on. So being careful to pick the right words to match with that is really an important aspect. The second part of being very intentional is to make word learning transparent. How do you figure out unknown words? And I am thrilled to see that this is right there in the Common Core State Standards. The language we've been using for several years about how you make word learning transparent is right there in the Common Core State Standards. One way to figure out a word is to look inside the word. You look at the morphology, the roots and prefixes and suffixes and derivations and word families and then cognates. We can teach students a habit. It takes a lot of time. It's not a one-day lesson. It's not a, here's an example of looking inside a word. It's a habit that we have to build with students. When you come to an unknown word, one of the things you do is you look inside the word. Of course, it's not always going to work for you. If you take the word repeat, for example, if you take that apart, read, do again, peat, it doesn't help. We don't know what peating again means, and it doesn't make any sense in the context. We should show students when these systems don't work and when they do work. But to build a habit, a transferable and transportable skill for students so they can use across their day and after middle school, we should teach them to look inside words and that they know enough that when they come to an unknown word, one of the things that automatically pops into their mind is, I should look inside this word. We use inside and out to build that habit. We don't say you're going to use affixes and roots and families and derivations and cognates. We just say look inside the word. We can also look outside the word. We can get kids to build a habit that they can look for definitions and explanations. Are there other words around there that define the target word? Is there a restatement or a synonym there? Is there a contrast or an antonym there? Are there some general context clues that help you think about it? Did the author include punctuation? Are there dashes or commas or parentheses that help you understand the word? What is it that helps us in the terms of the context about could we figure it out? And if you've read the research on this, we've been seeing a fair amount from Beck and her colleagues and further back that about 50% of the time context clues will fail. But that means 50% of the time they'll work. It's not the solution. It's one habit we need to teach students is when you come to an unknown word, one of the things you can do is look at the context clues. Of course, we should also remind them that there are sometimes misdirective clues, clues that lead you astray in terms of definitions, as well as non-directive clues. They just don't help you at all. But we build that habit over time. Look inside the word, look outside the word. And if you look further outside the word, you go to resources. We didn't spend a lot of time on that, but if you really want to go to dictionaries and websites and ask other people, you can go even further outside and figure out the resources. We also need to make it usable. We can't just teach the words and model the words, select the good words, and assign kids to know them. We have to get kids talking using academic English. Use the words with their peers. There are all kinds of ways to do this. There are all kinds of instructional routines and strategies. But kids need to use that vocabulary in meaningful exchanges with their peers. And it doesn't matter to me if it's through a reading activity or a writing activity, an oral language activity. I want to hear kids using those academic language words on a regular basis. And it's a fun way to do it is to play games with the words. Just have fun with the words, get them using the words, thinking about the words, talking about the words. And they'll learn a whole bunch of the words just because they're talking and interacting. We also have to make it personal. We have to make sure that it's not just a peer activity. It's not just time to talk to each other. It's not just time to write. It's time when I expect that those words become part of your habits, that those words become part of what you will use in the appropriate academic situations on a regular basis. It's not just for school. It's for how you think about the world. I've taught you words that you need to learn individually. And we really want to see students assess their own progress. We can do a lot of checking for understanding. We can do lots of creative things. For example, one of my favorite ways to assess word knowledge is to give a student a word, a position in a sentence, and then some conditions around that sentence. For example, if I say to you, I'd like you to write the word cell, C-E-L-L, in the third position of a sentence that's more than 8 words long. If you know what the word means and you can control grammar around that word, you'll have a really interesting sentence. If you don't know what the word means, I'll know that from asking you to construct that sentence. I recently had students write the word constitution in the final position of a sentence exactly 10 words long a few weeks ago. They worked for a long time to get those sentences correct. And it was so obvious to me. Do they know what the word means, and do they understand how to use the word grammatically correctly in the sentence? And if not, I have to do some reteaching. We can also build opportunities beyond those kind of generative ways of creating sentences with words for students to assess their own progress. How do they feel about the words? What word meanings do they know? How many different ways can they use this word? That's part of what we have to do to have really independent ownership of the targeted vocabulary words. Making it a priority is a little hard. Sometimes our colleagues in content areas don't see the importance of vocabulary. They haven't really thought it through. I think one of our jobs is to help people realize that vocabulary is a driving force of whether or not we understand the rest of the curriculum. If you don't know what words someone's using, it's really hard to think about what they're saying. It's really hard to process it. And it's really hard to reproduce it back. We think a lot about using science, English, social studies content to make the most of vocabulary. So students are seeing target words in different disciplines, and they're doing some readings from primary source discipline documents so that the words appear in the context in which they're being used rather than a word list by itself. So as I think about how to build an effective vocabulary intervention for students, students who really think through the importance of vocabulary and how to teach vocabulary, I think one of the things we have to be careful of is where the words come from. There are literally thousands of words I could teach. I can't get to them all. The estimate is that if you did nothing else and you wanted to raise ninth graders, if you want to have kids ready for ninth grade when they enter ninth grade, when they leave middle school, they'll need about 88,500 word families to be successful on grade level in ninth grade. That's some studies from Hart, et cetera, Risley, and so 88,500 word families by the entry level of ninth grade. You have to teach like 158 words a day with no missed days to get there. That's just not going to happen. We can't teach that many words in a day. We have to pick the words that need instruction and understand that some of the words students are going to learn simply from reading and from listening and from talking. Some words we have to provide direct, systematic, intentional instruction on. And so pick the ones that are important. The second thing we have to do, we have got to model transparent word solving strategies. It's not just enough to teach kids individual words and have them reading. We have to show them how to think about words when they come to unknown words, to have a habit that they can go to. Elementary schools get kind of good at this. When you come to an unknown word, you get your mouth ready, you read it again, you reread it. There's these things that work that we talk about. As we move into young adolescence, we have to change some of those strategies. It's not just getting your mouth ready. It's not just looking at the picture clues. Those don't work for us anymore. We need to look at things like sophisticated uses of prefix, suffix, roots, bases, and context clues. And students don't just show up knowing how to do that. We have to show them how we do that with more complex texts. They have to use those words in their interactions with each other. We have to make sure that the words are coming out of their mouths and out of their pencils or pens or fingertips on a laptop. That has to be the expectation, that when we teach you these words, you're going to use these words. They need personalized activities. We have to hold students accountable for those words. It's not enough just to say, good luck, I taught you the words, I've assessed you, I expect you to use them on your own individually. And we have to look at the content. If we really want to take on vocabulary as a school-wide initiative in middle schools and high schools, we have to have some priority to the content. We learn words and they change their meaning in different content areas, and we have to be aware of that. We can't just teach one definition of the word. We have to teach other ways that the word might be used in other contexts. And that's vocabulary for success. You have to build a successful initiative in vocabulary for students to master and leave school learning words inside and out. Just not in for school, not inside school only, but outside school and beyond their day. I'm going to pause there and see if anybody has any questions.
Thank you, Doug. That was so informative. We have 2 questions in the queue now. Before we start, I just want to remind everybody to use the chat box in your control box and just type in your question in the chat box there. So while we wait for other questions, Doug, I have the first one is, how often should I teach vocabulary to my 7th grade students?
I think vocabulary is a daily, but not a lot of minutes, but daily. We should be doing some modeling of word solving, and we should do some instruction in word meaning on a daily basis. We should also, just as part of our instruction, expect students to use the target words that we've been teaching them, that there's an expectation when I get them into group work or when I get them into independent work, there's a reminder that they should be using the words that we've been teaching. I think it really, if you devoted 8 or 10 or 12 minutes to some really good word learning on a regular basis, it would start to influence all the other areas. Their writing will improve, their reading comprehension will improve. It's that important, and I think we forget that background knowledge and vocabulary are significant influencers on comprehension. And if we're going to get to, I'll just continue that thought, we're going to get to Common Core and get to text complexity and really have kids read really more complex, interesting, and worthy text, word learning is going to be critical. If you can't figure out any of the words, like I showed you on that brain class, we're not going to get them to complex text. We're just going to be assessing them on text they can't read.
Great. Thank you. Here's another question. I have ELL students, so should I lengthen this lesson duration time that I teach over 2 weeks, or how should I adapt it?
I think that's one effective way of doing it, is to add some time to a lesson, to stretch those lessons out so they get more talking time, more interaction time with the targeted vocabulary words, so we really know they get it, so we don't have to go back the next year and reteach the same words that we taught the year before. And I think that would be a very effective way of making sure that English learners really do develop that targeted vocabulary. I think the other thing we have to be continually aware of is we have to figure out how to get English learners reading more. I think we need to get all students reading more, but I think we have to pay attention to that. This reading volume has a profound impact on vocabulary knowledge and just general background knowledge. And I think a lot of times, if they're not currently reading grade level text, we don't have them reading much of anything. So we've got to get them into things they can read.
Okay, great. We have a few more here. With the expansion of technology, current language is changing so rapidly that words are taking on new meaning. How do we address this in our curriculum for vocabulary?
I think that, well, in my classroom I have a word wall for our target words for my students, and my students have a word wall for me of words they want me to know that are usually, and they can't make, I say the only condition is it's a word that, I don't want a word that's going to get me beat up on the street. But they teach me all these vocabulary around technology. And so I think it's a fair trade. If I ask you to use these, to learn these words on my word wall list, then you can have me learn these other words on your word wall list. It's mostly related to technology and things like that. I think we also have to realize that the language has been changing for hundreds of years. It will continue to change. We add words all the time. We add meanings to words and change definitions for words all the time. And that's part of our role, is to teach kids transportable strategies that they can use when they leave us, so they still know how to think about words that are used in a different context. It's kind of confusing.
Great. Here's one that they would like an example of a personalized individual activity.
Sure. There are a couple. One, I use vocabulary self-collection strategy. That's my current favorite, and it's a 3-column journal, and it's the word, an example, a meaning of the word, and a definition of the word, and then they date when they've mastered that word. And sometimes I say to the whole class, here's a new word. Everyone needs it in their vocabulary self-collection strategy folder, and sometimes the words are individual, or sometimes it's from a small group. So some words the class will have in common, and then if I'm working with a small group of students and we come across a word, we'll add that word for the 5 kids. Sometimes it's for individual. So over time, their VSS section of their writer's notebook changes because different kids have different words in them. That's one way to have them individually accountable for it. We also use word cards. We have students create word cards. They're based on the Frere model. You take a 3x5 or 5x7 card and draw it into quadrants, to 4 quadrants. You put the word in one of the quadrants, what it means, in one what it doesn't mean, and then an illustration. Those are the 4 areas. I require that students have 5 signatures from adults on the back of the card that show they know the words, and it can't be me, so they have to talk to other people about the words. And when they have 5 signatures, they can take that card off their ring because 5 people have said they know that word. So we play all kinds of different ways with them, holding them individually accountable for those words.
That's a great idea.
We also, by the way, our students make 30-second video spots for the vocabulary that we're learning each week too. It's called Learn a Word in 30 Seconds, Bet You Can. And they spend so much time making these little clips, and then we post them, and they watch each other, and they are humorous and silly and fun, and they really do learn the words. I don't give them any class time to do that. They do that in the after-school program, and they go down and they take their phones and they make these little videos and post them. And that's another way, if they don't want to do word cards, if they post 30-second spots on the target vocabulary words, they don't have to do the word cards.
Well, Doug, that's a great expansion for Vocabulary for Success. Here's another question. You mentioned context, clues, word parts, and they missed the third one when you first started talking about the intentional vocabulary program. What was the third one, Doug?
Sorry about that. It's resources. It's
okay.
Knowing that when context clues and words parts don't work, that there are resources for you to use. And it may be as simple as asking another person. It could be going online. It could be using a dictionary. It's the knowledge that I can find out what this word means from other sources. And that's, again, right in the Common Core State Standards, is that we use word parts, context clues, and resources.
Okay, here's a question, kind of a affirmation. I have students devise word games or puzzles and share the activities in class. Is this a good example of collaborative learning?
Yes, that is a very good example of collaborative learning. And if we get kids to play games with words and they're saying the words over and they're coming up with definitions of words and they're enjoying it, they're very likely to remember it later.
Well, that's all the questions we have. If we want to wait a minute, Doug, just a few seconds for people to type in the chat box for their questions. These have been very good questions.
And do you want, I didn't put my website in there. If you want my website, it's Fisher and Fry, F-I-S-H-E-R-A-N-D-F-R-E-Y. I'll say it again. F-I-S-H-E-R-A-N-D-F-R-E-Y, fisherandfry.com. All kinds of resources under the resource tab. There's all kinds of PowerPoints if you want them. There's a contact button to write to me if you want that. But there's a way to continue this conversation if you're interested.
You know, Doug, what we'll do, excuse me, we'll be reaching out to everyone here that has attended. We'll be sending the link to the recorded webinar here, and I'll go ahead and I'll put your Fisher and Fry website link on that.
Great. We also launched a YouTube channel, Fisher and Fry, no spaces, Fisher and Fry, and have a whole bunch of our video collection up there if it's interesting to anybody who wants to have PD resources, so we can add that as well, the YouTube channel.
Oh, that's exciting. Okay, well, we don't have any more questions, Doug, so thank you so much for spending this time with us this afternoon. I know Nancy's going to be joining us next month for a webinar, so we will send out invitations for that presentation. And I'm sure on behalf of everyone that has attended today's workshop that this was very informative and very well presented. So thank you again. And thank you everyone for attending.
And thank you. And Nancy's is going to be on the links between Common Core and vocabulary. So that'll be a different take and a different content.
Yes. Yes. Thanks
Thank
again.
you all. I look forward to hearing from you.
Okay. Bye-bye now.